The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of fall leaves and distant rain. Officer sat in his patrol car, parked near the corner of 5th and Maple, watching the quiet suburban street. The radio had been unusually quiet for the past hour, which made him slightly restless. At 42 years old, had been with the state police for 15 years, and the predictable nights sometimes made him miss the adrenaline rush of his younger days. Beside him, Duke, his German Shepherd partner of 7 years, dozed peacefully, his muscular frame relaxed against the passenger seat. Even in sleep, Duke's posture suggested alertness, as if he could spring into action at any moment. Reached over and gently scratched behind Duke's ear. The dog opened one eye, his amber gaze meeting his handler's, before settling back into his rest. Their bond was deeper than most human friendships. They had trained together for years, responded to hundreds of calls, and trusted each other implicitly. Duke wasn't just a police dog he was family, a brother in uniform, a partner who would run into danger without hesitation if commanded it. The radio crackled suddenly, jolting from his thoughts. All units, we have a 1031 in progress at Miller's Convenience Store, 5th and Broadway. Suspect fled on foot heading east. Unknown description. All units respond. His pulse quickened instantly. A robbery, this was the call every officer trained for. He immediately started the engine and Duke's head snapped up, his instincts kicking in immediately. The dog knew that tone, that urgency in his voice. Duke stood, his body tensing with anticipation, his ears perked forward. "Ready, buddy?" asked, though he already knew the answer. The car shot forward, sirens wailing and lights flashing red and blue across the darkening neighborhoods. Navigated the streets with precision, his mind running through procedures and possibilities. Miller's Convenience Store was only 3 miles away. Other units were already responding, but had something they didn't. Duke. The dog was a tracking specialist, one of the best in the region. If they could get to the scene quickly and pick up a scent trail, they had an excellent chance of apprehending the suspect. 2 minutes later, pulled up to Miller's Convenience Store. Red and blue lights painted the parking lot in an eerie glow. 2 uniformed officers were already on scene, speaking with the store owner, an elderly man named George Miller who looked visibly shaken. George pointed east, toward the residential neighborhood. "He went that way," George called out, his voice trembling. "Grabbed the register drawer and just ran, had his face covered." Didn't waste time with questions. He opened the passenger door and Duke leaped out, landing gracefully on all 4 paws. The dog immediately began sniffing the air, his nostrils flaring as he processed the complex tapestry of scents around the store. Quickly clipped Duke to a long lead, not a regular leash, but a tracking line that gave the dog freedom to work while maintaining control. "Find," commanded, pointing in the direction George had indicated. Duke's entire body language shifted. His head dropped slightly as he caught the scent trail, and his muscles coiled with focus. The game was on. Jogged alongside his partner as Duke pulled them forward, moving with purpose through the parking lot and into the quiet residential streets beyond. The houses were set back from the road, most with their lights on, families settling in for the evening. The street was lined with old oak and maple trees, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the fading daylight into shadows and dappled patterns. His breathing was controlled, rhythmic, as he matched Duke's pace. The dog was pulling harder now, his nose working overtime, processing every molecule of scent carried on the evening breeze. They moved deeper into the neighborhood past quiet yards and sleeping suburbs. His mind raced with tactical considerations. Where would a suspect go? Would he try to hide in a basement, a garage, or would he keep running? The suspect had roughly a 5-minute head start, but Duke was faster than any human on foot, and he never got tired or lost a scent. Duke suddenly accelerated, pulling forward with surprising strength. The dog's excitement was palpable. He had locked onto the scent completely now. They rounded a corner and the dog's pace intensified. Could feel his own heart hammering in his chest. This was it. They were closing in. The neighborhoods blurred around them as they moved with increasing speed through the residential streets. They passed a small park on their left, park noted automatically, and Duke suddenly veered toward it, pulling along. The dog's breathing was heavy now, excited, primal. Every instinct in Duke's body screamed that they were about to find their target, had learned to read these signals perfectly. Duke's tail was raised, his ears forward, his body language radiating absolute confidence and hunting focus. The park was dimly lit, with playground equipment casting strange shadows in the gathering darkness. Beyond the playground, the landscape opened into more wooded areas, separated from the adjacent residential neighborhoods by fences and trees. Duke pulled through the park with unstoppable determination, his lead stretched tight. Then suddenly, the dog veered right, toward an area behind some thick hedges near the park's eastern boundary. Could hear Duke's accelerated breathing, the clicking of his nails on concrete, the desperate intensity of the chase. His own senses heightened, eyes scanning for any movement, ears listening for any sound that might indicate where the suspect was hiding. Duke froze suddenly, his entire body rigid, his nose pointing directly at a figure crouched behind a large oak tree approximately 20 feet away. There he was, a man, breathing heavily, trying to hide in the shadows. Immediately took control of the situation, his hand moving to his holster, his voice commanding and clear. "Police, don't move. Release the suspect right now." The man's eyes widened in terror as he realized he'd been found. He tried to run, attempting to bolt deeper into the wooded area behind the park, but Duke was faster and released the dog with a single word. Duke exploded forward with controlled aggression, his training focused entirely on apprehension and control, not harm. The dog's movements were precise, practiced, perfected over 7 years of training and real-world scenarios. What happened next would become the center of a firestorm of controversy, conflicting testimonies and accusations that would threaten to destroy his entire career. But in that moment, and Duke were simply doing what they had trained to do, their job. The man they tackled was James, a 38-year-old with a history of petty theft and drug-related charges. He went down hard, his body slamming against the rough ground as Duke performed exactly what he'd been trained to do, controlled apprehension. Reached him within seconds, his police training taking over completely. He secured his hands behind his back, reading him his rights in a steady, professional voice while Duke stood guard, his body tense and ready to prevent any escape attempt. What happened next seemed routine too. Was injured, his left arm had bite marks and his leg showed signs of trauma, called for an ambulance and secured the scene. The arrest had taken less than 2 minutes from the moment Duke was released. By the time backup units arrived, was in custody, and the convenience store robber was apprehended. From his perspective, it was a textbook K-9 apprehension. The dog had done his job perfectly, responding to commands, using appropriate force, and securing the suspect without causing unnecessary harm. But his version told a completely different story. As the ambulance transported him to County General Hospital, began telling paramedics a shocking narrative. He claimed that Duke had attacked him without provocation, that the dog had mauled him viciously, and that officer had encouraged the violence. He said he'd fallen to the ground, tried to protect himself, and the dog had continued attacking despite his pleas for mercy. He claimed had laughed as the dog bit him. His injuries, while not life-threatening, were real and documented by hospital staff. The bite marks on his arm were deep and angry-looking. His leg had contusions that could easily be interpreted as evidence of aggressive dog attack. By the following morning, had filed a formal complaint with the state police department, alleging excessive force and animal cruelty. More significantly, he'd contacted a personal injury attorney named David, a shark of a lawyer known for aggressive tactics and media savvy. Saw an opportunity, a wounded man, a large police dog, and a sympathetic narrative. He immediately began building a case against officer and the police department. The story hit the local news that afternoon. Police dog attack leaves man injured. the headline read on the 6 o'clock news. The story was brief but damaging. It mentions allegations without much context about the robbery or the circumstances of the arrest. One news anchor even speculated about police brutality, using language carefully chosen to sound objective while actually inflaming the situation. By evening, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets and shared thousands of times on social media. First learned about the complaint when his sergeant called him into his office the next morning. Captain Richard, a stern man with 30 years on the force, sat behind his desk with his fingers steepled, his expression grave. "We've received a formal complaint," Captain said quietly. "The suspect, James, is alleging that your dog attacked him without justification and that you encouraged the aggression. He's claiming excessive force and animal cruelty." Felt his stomach drop. "That's ridiculous. The arrest was by the book. Duke responded to my commands perfectly, resisted and tried to run. Duke apprehended him exactly as trained." "I believe you," Captain said, though his tone suggested he was going through the motions. "But we have to investigate. The department has to be thorough. You're being placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Turn in your badge and your service weapon." The words hit like a physical blow. Administrative leave. It was the police equivalent of exile. Even if he was ultimately exonerated, the damage would linger. His reputation would be questioned. His competence would be doubted. And Duke, what would happen to Duke? "What about my partner?" asked immediately. "Duke will be restricted from active duty pending investigation," Captain said. "He'll be kept in the K-9 unit facility." Felt rage, despair, and betrayal churning in his chest. After 15 years of exemplary service, one controversial call, one routine apprehension, was now threatening everything he'd built. That's when Detective Sarah entered the picture. Sarah was Captain's younger sister, a detective with the state police's major crimes unit. She was intelligent, thorough, and respected throughout the department. She was assigned to investigate the complaint against. Over the next week, she collected evidence: body camera footage, witness statements, the security camera video from Miller's convenience store and nearby traffic cameras, and medical reports from both's injuries and the standard documentation of K-9 apprehensions. What she found was frustratingly unclear. The body camera footage showed only partial views of the actual apprehension. The angle didn't capture Duke's initial contact with clearly. The security camera from Miller's didn't show the chase or the apprehension at all. Traffic cameras showed and Duke running, but not the moment of contact with the suspect. Medical records confirms injuries, but didn't indicate whether they were excessive for a K-9 apprehension or reasonable given the circumstances. The witness statements were wildly contradictory. One woman who lived near Park said she'd heard screaming and believed the dog was being too aggressive. Another neighbor said the dog had been controlled and professional. A jogger who'd been in the park said she saw the suspect resisting and trying to flee. Everyone had different interpretations of what they'd witnessed. Detective interviewed thoroughly. He remained calm and professional, recounting exactly what had happened, explaining his commands to Duke, describing the suspect's resistance and attempted escape. The account was consistent and detailed, but Sarah could see the toll the investigation was taking on him. His shoulders were tense, his eyes reflected exhaustion and hurt, and his voice occasionally cracked when discussing Duke's restriction from duty. Meanwhile, the media frenzy intensified. David's attorney was brilliant at working the press. He released statements suggesting that the police department was trying to protect one of their own, that the investigation was biased, that a victim was being silenced. He appeared on local news programs showing his injuries to cameras while described his alleged trauma. The narrative was compelling and sympathetic, even if it was factually questionable. Public opinion began to shift. Social media erupted with demands for accountability. Animal rights activists joined the chorus, suggesting that police dogs were inherently dangerous and that the department should eliminate the K-9 unit entirely. One prominent activist group announced they were launching a campaign against police dog violence. The police department, feeling the political pressure, publicly announced they were investigating thoroughly. But their statement was careful, neutral, and to many observers seemed to suggest they were distancing themselves from. His colleagues grew distant. Some avoided eye contact in the hallway. Others whispered when he walked past. The department suspended him without pay pending the investigation's conclusion. Sat at home, unable to see Duke, unable to work, unable to clear his name. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat properly. His wife, Jennifer, tried to support him, but she was scared too. Their savings wouldn't last forever if this investigation dragged on. Felt his entire identity crumbling. For 15 years, he had been a police officer. Now, suspended and under investigation, he was nothing. The man who had dedicated his life to serving and protecting his community was being treated like a criminal. He didn't know that help was coming from an unexpected source, a tiny girl with curls who had witnessed something that day in park. Emma was 3 years old and 3 months, a fact she proudly announced to anyone who would listen. She had curls that her mother struggled to keep brushed, bright blue eyes that missed nothing, and the uninhibited honesty that only young children possessed. She lived with her parents, and in a modest 2-story house on Elm Street, in the quiet residential neighborhood that bordered Park. Emma's world was small and wonderfully detailed. She knew every crack in her backyard patio, every flower in her mother's garden, every branch of the old oak tree that stood in the corner of their yard. She was a curious child, always asking why and what's that, her mind constantly processing the world around her with the intensity of a little scientist. Her parents often marveled at her observations, the way she noticed details they missed, the way she remembered conversations and events with surprising clarity for such a young child. On the afternoon of the incident, Emma was in her backyard playing with her collection of plastic building blocks. She had arranged them in a line across the concrete patio, creating what she called a rainbow road. She wore a pink sundress with yellow daisies embroidered on it, and her small feet were bare, her toenails still painted a fading purple from last week's salon trip with her grandmother. The September weather was beautiful, warm but not hot, the kind of afternoon that made children want to stay outside forever. Emma's mother was inside the house preparing dinner. Through the sliding glass door, she could see Emma playing contentedly. Occasionally, she'd glance out to check on her daughter, but Emma was in the safely fenced backyard and felt comfortable allowing her some independent play time. Emma was a good child, obedient and not prone to wandering. The fence was secure, 6 feet tall, made of weathered wood with occasional gaps where the boards had shifted over time. Emma was so absorbed in her block game that she almost didn't notice the commotion. But then she heard voices, shouting, the sound of rapid footsteps and something else, a sound she recognized immediately because she loved dogs. It was barking, not angry barking, but focused, purposeful barking. Emma's head snapped up. She stood, her blocks forgotten, and moved toward the fence. There was a gap between 2 boards near the corner of their yard, just wide enough for curious 3-year-olds to peek through. Emma, being curious by nature and small enough to fit, positioned herself at the gap and peered into Park. What she saw captured her complete attention. A man was running. He looked scared, his face red and his movements frantic. Behind him was a police officer in a dark uniform, and beside the officer was a dog. The dog was huge compared to Emma's experience with animals. It was a German shepherd, muscular and powerful, with fur that looked like it had multiple shades of brown and black. But what fascinated Emma most wasn't the dog's size. It was the way the dog moved. The dog was running with incredible purpose and control. Its eyes were focused on the running man, but it wasn't lunging wildly or seeming out of control. The police officer was running alongside the dog, and Emma noticed immediately that the officer had some kind of line attached to the dog. The officer's voice was loud and commanding, but not mean. He was saying things Emma couldn't quite understand, but his tone was serious and controlled. Emma watched as the scene unfolded before her young eyes. The man kept running, trying to navigate through the park, and the dog kept pace, responsive to the officer's hand signals and voice commands. Emma had seen dogs before. The neighbor had a golden retriever that was friendly and playful, but she'd never seen a dog like this. This dog was different. This dog was working. The running man suddenly changed direction, trying to flee deeper into the wooded area behind the park. But the dog was faster. The officer released something. Emma wouldn't have understood that it was the dog's leash, and the dog accelerated with incredible speed and agility. The dog didn't seem angry or vicious to Emma. Instead, the dog seemed purposeful, determined. Within seconds, the man fell to the ground. The dog stood over him, but Emma's young mind didn't interpret this as aggression. The dog's posture seemed protective rather than attacking. The officer came running up, his voice still commanding but calm. Emma saw him do something to the man's arms, heard him talking in that serious voice again. The entire incident lasted maybe 3 minutes. Then there were other people arriving, more police, a vehicle with flashing lights. Emma lost interest and turned back to her blocks. She'd seen something interesting, but her attention span was that of a 3-year-old. She returned to her Rainbow Road, humming softly to herself. Later, when her mother called her in for dinner, Emma mentioned what she'd seen. "Mommy, there was a big doggy in the park, a police doggy. He was very fast." Glanced at her daughter while stirring pasta. "That's nice, sweetie. Were you being safe in the yard?" "Yes, the doggy helped the man. He was a good doggy," Emma said, swinging her legs under the dinner table. Smiled, attributing it to her daughter's active imagination. Kids that age mixed reality with fantasy all the time. Emma probably saw something and interpreted it through her child's perspective. "That's good, honey. I'm glad you had fun playing." But Emma was unusually insistent about the detail. Over the following days, she kept mentioning it. The doggy listened to the man. The doggy was nice. The doggy helped. She drew pictures with crayons. A big brown shape she identified as the dog, a smaller figure she said was the policeman, and another figure she identified as the running man. Her parents found it endearing but dismissed it as childhood fancy. Children had active imaginations. Emma was probably creating an elaborate story based on something she'd half seen or half heard. They didn't connect it to any real event because they hadn't heard about the incident yet. The news coverage focused on the robbery and the allegations, not specifically on Park or the neighborhood where it occurred. It wasn't until nearly a week later that the significance of Emma's observation would begin to emerge. Detective Sarah was conducting a thorough canvass of the neighborhood surrounding Park. She was methodical and thorough, the kind of detective who left no stone unturned. She knocked on doors, spoke with neighbors, asked if anyone had witnessed the incident on that Thursday afternoon. Most people hadn't been home or hadn't noticed anything unusual, but when she arrived at the residence, something made her approach the door with particular attention. Sarah knocked and answered. Sarah identified herself as a detective and asked if anyone in the house had witnessed an incident in Park approximately a week ago. Was about to say no when she remembered Emma's constant chatter about the police doggy and the big doggy who helped. "Actually," said hesitantly, "my daughter was playing in our backyard that day. She mentioned seeing something, but she's only 3 years old, so I'm not sure how reliable her observations would be." Detective's eyes widened slightly. A witness, even an unlikely one, was worth investigating. "May I speak with her?" she asked. As Emma was brought to the door, small and holding a stuffed animal rabbit, Detective realized she might be looking at the most important witness in the entire case, even if that witness was just a child. Weeks crawled by with agonizing slowness, for each day felt like an eternity. The administrative leave stretched from days into weeks, and the investigation showed no signs of concluding. He existed in a strange limbo, not officially fired but not working either. He spent his days at home, unable to see Duke, unable to clear his name, unable to move forward with his life. The financial pressure was mounting. His savings account was draining steadily, and his wife Jennifer's nursing income alone wasn't enough to cover their mortgage, utilities, and basic expenses. The stress was beginning to crack the foundation of their marriage. Jennifer tried to be supportive but could see the worry in her eyes. She'd catch him staring at nothing, lost in his thoughts. Sometimes he'd find her in the kitchen late at night, scrolling through her phone, looking at their bank account balance with a furrowed brow. They'd have quiet conversations about the possibility of taking out a loan, downsizing, finding additional income. The weight of it all was crushing in ways that even the investigation itself wasn't. The media coverage continued relentlessly. David James Saturni was a master of public relations. He appeared on every local news channel willing to have him, discussing his client's injuries, the trauma of the attack, and the apparent cover-up by law enforcement. He released photographs of bite marks, carefully photographed to look as dramatic and devastating as possible. He gave interviews suggesting that the police department was protecting one of their own, that the investigation was a sham, that justice would only come through civil litigation and public pressure. Online, the story had taken on a life of its own. Animal rights activists seized on it as evidence that police dogs were inherently dangerous and aggressive. There were calls to eliminate the K-9 unit entirely, to ban police dogs, to reform the department from the ground up. Social media algorithms amplified the most sensational claims, and soon the narrative had shifted entirely from police apprehend robbery suspect to police dog brutally attacks innocent man. Attorney Robert Williams was a sharp criminal defense lawyer with 20 years of experience. He was best hope, but even he was beginning to show signs of strain. Robert was a realist, and he knew the case was weak. During one of their meetings in his office, Robert laid it out bluntly. "Here's our problem," Robert said, leaning back in his leather chair. "We have conflicting witness statements. We have video footage that doesn't clearly show what actually happened. We have injuries that supports narrative, whether or not it's truthful. And we have a media machine working against us around the clock." "What about the body camera?" asked desperately. "My body camera shows." "Your body camera shows a partial view," Robert interrupted, not unkindly. "It shows you apprehending a suspect and Duke doing what he was trained to do. But it doesn't show the suspect's injury occurring. It doesn't show the moment of contact. It shows context, but not the specific incident that's in dispute." Felt his chest tightening. "So what do? "We build a defense," Robert said. "We get expert witnesses on K-9 protocols and training. We demonstrate that your conduct was consistent with department procedures and law enforcement standards. We show that resisted apprehension and attempted to flee. But I'm not going to lie to you. This is an uphill battle. Public opinion is against us. The media is against us. And the police department, while publicly supporting you, seems to be keeping their distance." The trial date was set for November 15th. It was now early November and felt like he was running out of time and options. He'd been suspended without pay for 6 weeks. Their savings were depleting rapidly. His career, his reputation, his identity, everything was hanging in the balance. One evening, sat alone in his study, staring at photographs on his wall. There were pictures of him in his police academy uniform, photos of him receiving commendations, images of him and Duke together during their training exercises. They represented 15 years of dedication, sacrifice, and service, and all of it felt like it was about to evaporate. His phone rang. It was Robert. "I just got off the phone with Detective," Robert said without preamble. "She's been investigating the scene and conducting interviews. She's found some inconsistencies in story, and she's also spoken with several neighbors who give accounts that actually support your version of events. But here's the thing, she mentioned something strange. She said there might be another witness, a very young witness." His heart rate accelerated. "What do you mean, young?" A 3-year-old child. Apparently, she lives near Park and may have witnessed the incident. The detective is still working on this angle, but she seemed to think it could be significant. After Robert hung up, sat in stunned silence. A 3-year-old. How could a child that young possibly testify in court? How could her observations possibly be relevant? And yet, something inside stirred, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, there was something he didn't know about that day, something that could help prove his innocence. The following week, was contacted by detective directly. She explained that she was investigating further and asked if he could provide any additional details about the arrest that he might not have mentioned. As they spoke, Sarah carefully explained her theory. "Officer, when you apprehended, what was his level of resistance? Be specific." "He tried to run," said. "After I commanded him to stop, he attempted to flee deeper into the woods. When Duke made contact with him, he went down. I don't think he was trying to fight Duke off violently. He seemed more panicked than aggressive." "That's consistent with what I'm hearing from other witnesses," detective said carefully. "I'm still investigating, and I can't promise anything, but I'm following some leads that might prove helpful." As the trial date approached, experienced a roller coaster of emotions. One day he felt hopeful, the next day despair would crash over him like a wave. His marriage was strained. His health was suffering. He'd lost 15 pounds and dark circles under his eyes made him look years older. He thought about Duke constantly. How was his partner doing? Was Duke confused about why wasn't coming to get him? Did the dog think had abandoned him? The night before the trial began, couldn't sleep. He lay in bed next to his sleeping wife, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through possibilities. He thought about his career, his legacy, his honor. He thought about the thousands of hours he'd spent training and working with Duke. He thought about every person he'd helped as a police officer. And he thought about a 3-year-old girl he'd never met, who might hold the key to his salvation, or might mean absolutely nothing at all. The uncertainty was almost unbearable. Robert Williams sat in his office late on a Tuesday evening, the November rain beating against the windows. His desk was covered with legal briefs, court precedents, and handwritten notes. Next to his computer was a tablet displaying detectives' report about the 3-year-old witness. Robert had been practicing law for 2 decades, and he'd never attempted anything quite like what he was considering. The idea was unconventional, risky, and potentially career-defining. But he was desperate, and sometimes desperation breeds creativity. He'd spoken with detective at length. Emma's account was remarkable, not because it was legally binding or formally admissible, but because of what it suggested about the nature of the incident. A child's unfiltered observations, unburdened by adult prejudices or interpretations, might actually provide clarity. Emma had consistently described Duke's behavior as controlled and helpful. She'd specifically stated that the dog listened to the man and was good. These were the observations of someone too young to lie, or to construct an elaborate narrative. But could a 3-year-old testify in court? Under normal circumstances, absolutely not. A child that young couldn't be sworn under oath. Courts generally required witnesses to understand the nature and consequences of perjury, to have the cognitive capacity to accurately remember events, and to communicate their observations clearly. A 3-year-old failed on almost every one of those criteria. However, Robert realized there might be another avenue. What if Emma didn't formally testify? What if she simply made a statement, non-binding, informally presented, carrying no legal weight? Judge Harold, who was presiding over the case, was known for being open-minded and interested in justice over technicalities. He was also known for allowing unusual procedures if they served the interests of fairness. Robert spent the next 2 days researching precedents, studying case law, and crafting a motion that would be unusual enough to be interesting, but grounded enough in legal principle to have a chance of acceptance. He drafted carefully, arguing that while Emma's testimony would be inadmissible in the traditional sense, her presence in the courtroom and her informal observation might provide relevant contextual information that could be considered by the judge in weighing the evidence. On Thursday morning, Robert submitted his motion to the court. Judge Harold received it in his chambers and read it twice. His first reaction was skepticism. A 3-year-old in court. This was highly irregular, but as he continued reading Robert's argument, he found himself intrigued. The judge had been on the bench for 23 years, and he'd learned that sometimes the most important evidence came from unexpected sources. He decided to allow it. When Robert received the judge's approval via his clerk, he immediately contacted Detective, who in turn reached out to the family, and were shocked when Detective explained what was being proposed. Their 3-year-old daughter would be asked to make a statement in court. It would be informal, nothing she'd be forced to do, and she wouldn't be under oath. But her presence and her observations might help clarify an important case. Emma said, visibly shocked. She's 3 years old. She plays with blocks and watches cartoons. I don't understand how she could possibly help with a legal case. She may not be able to, Detective admitted. But what she observed that day was significant, and the judge has agreed to allow her to make an informal statement. There's no pressure. If she becomes upset or overwhelmed, we stop immediately. This is entirely voluntary. And exchanged looks. They were good people, civic-minded and interested in justice. They also didn't want their daughter traumatized by a courtroom experience. But they understood that their daughter had witnessed something important, and if her statement could help clarify the truth, then perhaps they had an obligation to allow it. "We'll do it," said finally. "But if Emma becomes distressed, we're taking her out of there." "Absolutely," Detective agreed. "That's completely understood." The following week, Robert Williams met with Emma's parents to prepare them. He explained the courtroom setting, what would happen, and how Emma would be treated. He was careful and gentle, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but professional and thorough. "She'll be asked simple questions," Robert explained. "Nothing complicated. The judge will speak to her directly, using language she can understand. The goal is simply to let her tell what she saw in her own words. No pressure, no tricks, just simple questions about that day." Spent the day before the trial preparing Emma in the gentlest way possible. She took her to the courthouse, showed her the empty courtroom, let her sit in different chairs, tried to demystify the space. Emma, with the resilience and adaptability of children, treated it like an adventure. "Will the big doggy be there?" she asked hopefully. "Maybe," said, not sure if Emma would actually see Duke during the proceedings. Meanwhile was experiencing an emotional whirlwind. Robert had explained the situation to him, that there was a very young witness who had observed the incident and who the court had agreed to allow to make a statement. His initial reaction was skepticism. How could a 3-year-old possibly help? And then, gradually, hope began to take root. The detective seemed confident. Robert seemed cautiously optimistic. There was a possibility, however small, that something unexpected might change the trajectory of this disaster. The night before the trial resumed, went to the police station. He didn't have any official business there. He was on suspension after all, but he requested to see Duke. Captain approved it, understanding the emotional weight of the situation. Walked into the K-9 unit facility and immediately saw his partner. Duke's entire body transformed when he recognized. The dog leaped to his feet, tail wagging so hard his entire rear end moved side to side. Duke barked, a joyful, excited bark, and pressed himself against the fence of his temporary enclosure. Unlatched the gate and Duke exploded into his arms, jumping up, licking his face, whining with the intensity of their separation. Held his partner, burying his face in Duke's fur, and for the first time in weeks he allowed himself to cry. This dog had done nothing wrong. Duke had simply been doing his job, following his training, responding to commands. And now Duke was confined, his reputation questioned, his future uncertain. "I'm sorry, buddy," whispered. "I'm so sorry, but we're going to make this right. I promise you we're going to make this right." Duke pressed his head against his chest, as if he understood, as if he was offering forgiveness and comfort. On the morning the trial resumed, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows. James sat at his table with David, looking confident and sympathetic in a carefully chosen gray suit. Sat with Robert Williams, feeling hollow and exhausted despite having finally slept the previous night. Then the back doors opened, and Emma walked in with her parents. She was small, wearing a pink dress with white flowers embroidered on it. She looked around the courtroom with the wide-eyed wonder of a child experiencing something entirely new. Her parents guided her to a specially prepared small table, and she sat down, her feet dangling several inches above the floor. The courtroom fell quiet. Judge entered and settled at the bench. He looked out at Emma with a mixture of curiosity and kindness. Then he began to speak to her gently, explaining in simple terms what they were all doing there. "Emma," he said warmly, "we're all here because we want to know what you saw one day when you were playing in your backyard. Is that okay? Can you tell us about that day?" Emma nodded seriously, her small face concentrated and determined. The moment that would change everything was about to unfold. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as Judge Harold leaned forward slightly, his expression warm and grandfatherly. He was an experienced judge who understood the psychology of communication, and he knew that his demeanor would set the tone for Emma's comfort level. Behind him, the American flag hung against the dark wood paneling. The overhead lights cast everything in a slightly sterile glow, making the courtroom feel both formal and somehow unreal. "Emma," Judge began gently, his voice softer than his usual courtroom tone, "do you remember a day when you were playing in your backyard and you saw a police officer and a big dog?" Emma nodded, her curls bouncing with emotion. She held her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest, and her blue eyes were focused intently on the judge. Despite her young age, there was something remarkably serious about her expression, as if she understood on some instinctive level that this moment mattered. "Yes," Emma said clearly, her voice small but distinct in the quiet courtroom. "I was playing with my blocks, my rainbow road." Several people in the courtroom exchanged subtle glances. The child seemed remarkably present and coherent. "That's good," Judge said encouragingly. "Can you tell me what you saw that day, what was happening?" Emma took a deep breath, her little fingers gripping the rabbit. There was a man running. He looked scared. His face was red. He was running really, really fast. "Okay," the judge said. "And what else did you see?" "The policeman was running too," Emma continued, her words coming out in the rapid, breathless way children spoke when they were excited or concentrating hard. "And there was a big doggy, a really big doggy, bigger than my neighbor's doggy, brown and black, and the doggy was running with the man." "The dog was running with the man?" Judge asked, wanting to clarify. "Yes," Emma said, nodding emphatically. "But the doggy wasn't being mean. The doggy was. The doggy was listening to the policeman. The policeman said things and the doggy listened." Across the courtroom, felt his heart rate accelerate. This was exactly how it had happened. Duke had been responsive to commands, obedient, controlled. David, attorney, was beginning to shift uncomfortably in his seat. He'd expected a young child to be confused or unreliable, but Emma was speaking with a clarity and specificity that was making him nervous. "Emma," Judge continued carefully, "what happened when the running man and the dog got to the same place? Can you tell me what you saw?" Emma's face scrunched up in concentration. She was quiet for a moment, clearly trying to remember the sequence of events. "The man fell down, he was on the ground, and the doggy was there with him." "Was the dog hurting the man?" Judge asked, using neutral language. "No," Emma said with surprising certainty. The doggy was keeping him there. Like when my mommy holds my hand so I don't run away, the doggy was keeping the man." In the gallery, felt tears prickling her eyes. Her daughter was describing exactly what she'd seen. with the clarity and honesty that only a young child could provide. "The doggy wasn't being mean?" Judge asked. "No," Emma said firmly. "The doggy was good. The doggy was helping. The policeman was there too, and he was telling the doggy what to do, and the doggy was listening." Robert Williams felt relief flooding through him. This was powerful testimony, not because it was legally conclusive, but because it came from someone too young to lie, too innocent to construct an elaborate narrative. Emma was simply describing what she'd witnessed with the unfiltered honesty of a 3-year-old. David was now looking genuinely concerned. He stood up. "Your Honor, I'd like to cross-examine the child." Judge raised an eyebrow. "Mister, this is an informal statement, not formal testimony. There's no cross-examination. The purpose here is to allow the court to hear an unfiltered account of what this child observed." "But Your Honor," began. "I've made my ruling," Judge said firmly. Then he turned his attention back to Emma. "Emma, I have one more question for you. That big dog that you saw, do you remember what he looked like? Can you describe him to me?" Emma's face brightened. "He was big and brown and black. He had pointy ears, and he was very fast. He was the bestest dog." Judge nodded. "Well, Emma, we might have that dog here in the courthouse today. If we bring him in, do you think you might recognize him?" Emma's eyes went wide. "Really? The doggy is here?" "Maybe," Judge said. "Would you like to see?" Emma nodded vigorously, her entire small body radiating excitement at the prospect of seeing the dog again. Judge gestured to a court officer. "Please bring the K-9 into the courtroom." The courtroom fell into a tense silence. Everyone understood the significance of what was about to happen. If Emma recognized Duke, if she confirmed that this was the same dog she'd observed, it would powerfully reinforce her testimony. But if she didn't recognize him, if there was any confusion, it could undermine her credibility. The back doors of the courtroom opened, and Officer Thomas, who was handling Duke in absence, led the German Shepherd into the courtroom on a professional lead. Duke was calm and well-behaved, his training evident in his composed demeanor. The dog's ears perked up as he entered the courtroom, sensing something unusual about this environment. Emma's entire body went rigid. Her grip on the stuffed rabbit loosened, her eyes fixed on Duke with absolute, unwavering certainty. The recognition was instantaneous and complete. This was the dog. There was no doubt, no confusion, no hesitation. Judge watched Emma carefully. "Emma, do you recognize this dog?" For a moment, Emma didn't answer. She was frozen, staring at Duke with an intensity that seemed to transcend her age. Then slowly, she stood up on her small chair. Her parents moved to help her, but she waved them away, her attention completely fixed on the German Shepherd. Emma opened her mouth. Her voice, when it came, was clear and absolute, cutting through the courtroom silence like a bell. "He helped," she shouted, pointing directly at Duke. "He helped, he helped." The courtroom erupted. Judge raised his gavel, calling for order, but his eyes remained on the small child and the dog. Emma was still pointing, still repeating her proclamation. "The doggy helped, he was good, he helped." Felt tears streaming down his face. Beside him, Robert Williams had gone pale, his hand covering his mouth. In the gallery was openly crying, her husband's arm around her. Duke, sensing the emotional intensity in the room, remained calm and professional, his training keeping him steady. But his eyes had found in the courtroom, and for just a moment, the bond between handler and dog seemed to transcend everything else in that space. David had gone completely white. His entire case was crumbling before his eyes. A 3-year-old, unbiased and incapable of lying, had just provided the most powerful exoneration possible. Judge gavelled the courtroom back to order. He looked at Emma with something between amazement and profound respect. This tiny child had done what hours of testimony and evidence could not quite accomplish. She had spoken the truth with absolute clarity and certainty. "Thank you, Emma," Judge said quietly. "You've been very brave and very helpful. You can sit down now." Emma sat, finally releasing her grip on the stuffed rabbit. She looked proud and tired at the same time, as if she understood on some deep level that she'd done something important. The courtroom was silent. Everyone understood that something significant had just happened, something that would determine the outcome of the case. The courtroom seemed suspended in time after Emma's declaration. Judge sat motionless on the bench, his gavel held loosely in his hand. The child's words, simple, clear, and absolute, had somehow cut through weeks of complicated legal arguments, conflicting testimony, and media manipulation. It was as if a door had been opened to a clarity that everyone had been struggling to find. David was frantically whispering with James, his hand gesturing in agitated movements. His confident, sympathetic expression had cracked, replaced by something closer to panic. His attorney was trying to salvage the situation, but everyone in the courtroom could sense that something fundamental had shifted. Judge called for a brief recess, giving both sides time to absorb what had just happened and prepare their closing arguments. As officers escorted Emma and her parents from the courtroom, Emma waved at Duke. The dog, still remarkably composed for an animal in an unusual environment, tilted his head slightly in acknowledgement, wanted to run to his partner to embrace him, to thank him for the loyalty and partnership that had been so publicly validated. But protocol kept him in his seat. During the recess, Robert Williams pulled aside into a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. "That," Robert said, his voice trembling slightly, "was the most powerful piece of testimony I've ever witnessed in 20 years of practicing law." "Is it enough?" asked, hardly daring to hope. "Can we win?" "A 3-year-old just told the entire courtroom that Duke was controlled, responsive, and helpful," Robert said. "She independently everything you said about that day. She described your commands and Duke's response to them. And most importantly, she, without any possibility of bias or manipulation, that the dog was good and was helping. I think we have an excellent chance." Felt something shift in his chest. For the first time in weeks, genuine hope wasn't just a whisper, it was a roar. When court reconvened, David presented his closing argument. He was a professional, and he tried to minimize the impact of Emma's statement. He argued that a 3-year-old couldn't possibly understand the complexities of a police apprehension, that children were notoriously unreliable witnesses, that Emma was probably describing something she didn't fully comprehend. But his words sounded hollow now, defensive, almost desperate. The energy in the courtroom had fundamentally shifted, and everyone could feel it. Robert Williams then presented his closing argument. He was methodical and careful, walking through the evidence piece by piece. He described the K-9 training protocols, explained that Duke had responded exactly as trained, highlighted the inconsistencies in story. But the centerpiece of his argument was Emma's testimony. Robert said, addressing Judge, "We've heard from experts about police procedures. We've examined video footage and body camera recordings. We've analyzed witness statements. But sometimes the clearest truth comes from the most unexpected source. A 3-year-old child sitting in this courtroom described exactly what happened that day. She had no bias, no agenda, no reason to lie. She simply told the truth as she observed it. She said the dog was good. She said the dog was helping." That is the testimony of an innocent observer, and it corroborates everything officer has told us. The courtroom was silent as Robert sat down. Judge looked thoughtful, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "I'm going to take this under advisement," Judge announced. "I need time to review all the evidence, consider the testimony, and make a reasoned decision. This is a serious matter with significant implications. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock for my verdict." As the court was dismissed, felt overwhelmed by competing emotions. Hope and despair, relief and anxiety, gratitude and lingering fear. Tomorrow, his entire life would be determined by Judge's decision. Tomorrow, he would either be exonerated or convicted, figuratively if not literally. The waiting would be excruciating. That night couldn't sleep. He lay in bed beside his wife, staring at the ceiling, his mind running through endless scenarios. Jennifer held his hand in the darkness, offering what comfort she could through simple physical connection. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. Everything that could be said had been said in that courtroom. At 8:45 the next morning was sitting in the courtroom with Robert Williams. The space was full again. Reporters, observers, curious citizens. James sat at the prosecution table, looking noticeably less confident than he had the previous day. David was reviewing documents, but his body language was tense. At exactly 9 o'clock, Judge entered. The courtroom fell silent immediately. The judge settled into his seat, and his expression was grave and serious. "I have spent considerable time reviewing this case," Judge began, his voice carrying through the courtroom. "I have examined the evidence, considered the testimony, and reflected carefully on the legal and factual issues at hand. This case presents a situation where much of the evidence is circumstantial and subject to interpretation. However, there are some facts that are not subject to interpretation." His heart was pounding so hard, he was certain everyone could hear it. "Officer responded appropriately to his dispatch call," Judge continued. "He apprehended a robbery suspect using K-9 assistance, as is standard police procedure. The suspect resisted apprehension and attempted to flee. Under these circumstances, the use of a trained police dog is both appropriate and lawful. The suspect's injuries are consistent with lawful apprehension by a trained K-9 unit, not with excessive force or animal cruelty." Felt tears beginning to form. "Furthermore," Judge said, "I have received testimony from an eyewitness, a 3-year-old child, who observed this incident without bias or agenda. This child provided an account consistent with officer's version of events. She that the dog was controlled, responsive to commands, and engaged in protective rather than aggressive behavior. While this testimony is informal and carries no legal weight it corroborates the evidence and lends credibility to the officer's account." Judge paused, looking directly at. "Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that officer acted lawfully and appropriately in the performance of his duties. The complaint filed by James is hereby dismissed. Furthermore, I am recommending to the police department that officer be immediately reinstated to active duty with full compensation for the period of suspension." The courtroom erupted. Robert Williams was shaking his hand, his eyes wet with tears. Reporters were scrambling to exit and file their stories. In the gallery, and were hugging each other, their daughter's role in this moment finally validated. Stood up feeling like he might float away. His career was saved. His reputation was restored. Duke was vindicated. Everything he'd lost seemed to be returning. But the most overwhelming moment came when Officer Thomas brought Duke into the courtroom one final time. The dog took one look at and pulled forward so forcefully that almost lost his grip on the lead. Dropped to his knees as Duke bounded toward him, and the German Shepherd practically tackled his handler with the force of 7 weeks of separation channeled into pure joy. "It's okay, buddy," whispered, burying his face in Duke's fur. "It's all going to be okay now. We're going home." Judge, watching from the bench, allowed himself a small smile. He'd been on the bench for over 2 decades, presiding over countless cases. But he knew he'd never forget this one, the case where a 3-year-old had spoken the truth that set an innocent man free. 3 months had passed since Judge's verdict. Winter had fully descended on the state, transforming the landscape into a world of white snow and bare branches. But inside the police department headquarters, there was warmth and celebration. Officer stood at the podium in the main auditorium, looking healthier than he had in months. The weight he'd lost during the investigation had returned. His eyes were clear, his posture confident. Beside him stood Captain Richard, Police Commissioner Wells, and most importantly, Duke, his German Shepherd partner, wearing his official K-9 unit vest with pride. The auditorium was packed. Other officers, department personnel, media representatives, and members of the community had gathered for a special commendation ceremony. Commissioner Wells approached the podium, holding an official plaque. "Officer," the commissioner began, her voice carrying through the auditorium, "your dedication to service, your integrity in the face of adversity, and your unwavering commitment to this department and this community exemplify the highest ideals of law enforcement. You are hereby restored to full active duty with commendation and compensation for the period of unjust suspension. Furthermore, you are receiving the department commendation for outstanding service." The auditorium erupted in applause. Officers stood and cheered. Unaccustomed to being the center of positive attention after weeks of scrutiny, felt overwhelmed. Duke, sensing his handler's emotional state, pressed against his leg in support. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when little Emma was invited to the stage. Now wearing a special junior police officer badge that the department had created just for her, Emma walked up the aisle holding her father's hand. When she saw Duke, her face lit up with pure joy. "Hi, doggy," she called out, and the entire auditorium melted at the sight of the 3-year-old approaching the 100-pound German Shepherd. Knelt down and gently guided Duke to sit. Emma, with the fearlessness of a child who had already helped an innocent man, wrapped her small arms around Duke's neck in a hug. The photograph of that moment, the massive dog and the tiny girl embracing, would become iconic, appearing in newspapers, online articles, and police department promotional materials for years to come. And watch from the audience, their hearts full. Their daughter had become something of a local celebrity. The story of the 3-year-old who told the truth had captured the public imagination in ways that the legal proceedings never could. People approached them regularly, thanking Emma, telling her she was brave, asking for photographs. "She's just being a kid," would say gently, though she understood the deeper significance of what had happened. In the weeks following the verdict, James' case had unraveled completely. Detective, emboldened by the verdict, had investigated further and discovered inconsistencies in his injury timeline. Medical records showed that some of his injuries predated the arrest, suggesting they came from a different incident. Additionally, other witnesses came forward, now that the narrative had shifted, describing how he had a history of making false complaints against police. His credibility, which had seemed so powerful in the media coverage, evaporated under scrutiny. David quietly from the case, his carefully constructed narrative demolished by a 3-year-old's testimony. The incident became a cautionary tale in legal circles about the dangers of media-driven narratives and the power of genuine, unfiltered truth. The media, having built up the story of police brutality, now had to pivot to a new narrative: the exoneration of an innocent officer and the vindication of police procedures. Some outlets handled this gracefully. Others seemed reluctant to give the same amount of coverage to the resolution that they had to the initial accusations. But the public understood. The story of Emma had resonated deeply. Parents talked about their own children's honesty and clarity. Child psychologists were interviewed about the cognitive abilities of young children. Law enforcement agencies nationwide began studying the case, wondering if there were lessons to be learned about K-9 procedures and public communication. For and Duke, life gradually returned to normal. They resumed their patrol schedule, continued their training, and answered dispatch calls as they always had. But something had changed. The experience had marked them both. Was more aware of how quickly reputation could be damaged, how important it was to maintain integrity and documentation. He became an advocate for body cameras and comprehensive K-9 training standards. He gave lectures at law enforcement academies about the importance of clear procedures and transparent documentation. Duke, unaware of the legal drama, simply resumed being the exceptional police dog he'd always been. But his legend had grown. The dog who had been falsely accused of brutality had become a symbol of law enforcement dedication and professionalism. Children pointed at him on the street. Other officers made a point of greeting him specially. Duke, with the grace that exceptional animals sometimes possess, accepted the attention with calm dignity. 1 year after the verdict, the family received an invitation. The police department was dedicating a new training facility and wanted to name it the Duke K-9 Training Center in honor of the case and its resolution. They were asking Emma, now 4 years old, to cut the ribbon at the opening ceremony. Emma, dressed in a small white dress for the occasion, stood beside Judge, who had come specifically for the event, holding oversized ceremonial scissors. When given the signal, she cut the ribbon, which fell away to reveal the new facility. Inside, the walls were decorated with photographs of the case, including several large prints of Emma with Duke. This facility, Judge said during his speech, is dedicated to the training of K-9 units and the advancement of best practices in law enforcement. But it also stands as a monument to something more important, the power of truth. A 3-year-old child walked into a courtroom and spoke the truth as she saw it. No lawyers, no arguments, no complicated legal language, just truth. And that truth changed everything. I encourage all law enforcement officers who train here to remember that principle. Truth, clarity, and integrity are the foundation upon which we build justice. As the years progressed, the story didn't fade. It became part of law enforcement lore. Police academies showed recordings of Emma's testimony as part of their ethics training. Child psychologists cited the case when discussing children's reliability as witnesses. Parents told their children about the little girl who helped a police officer. Emma, growing up, eventually learned the full story of what had happened that day in Park. Her parents told her about Officer, about Duke, about the trial. By the time she was a teenager, she understood the magnitude of what her young observation had accomplished. She'd received letters from people around the country, other officers who said her story had inspired them, parents who said it had taught their children about the importance of honesty, lawyers who'd studied the case in law school. At age 12, Emma visited the police station where Officer now worked as a K-9 unit supervisor. Duke was retired by then, living a comfortable life with his family. But the aging German Shepherd still had enough vitality to greet Emma with affection. Emma sat on the floor with the old dog, scratching behind his ears, talking to him as if he was an old friend, which, in a sense, he was. "Thank you," she said simply, not sure if she meant it for that day or for everything that had followed. Duke, understanding in the way dogs do that this moment mattered, rested his head against her leg. Officer, watching from nearby, felt tears in his eyes. He thought about the darkness of those weeks of suspension, the despair that had nearly consumed him, the fear that his career and his reputation would be destroyed forever. He thought about how a small child, playing with blocks in her backyard, had witnessed something and had the courage to speak truth to power. The case became known nationwide as a turning point in police accountability. Instead of being remembered as a scandal, it became a testament to the importance of transparent procedures, thorough investigations, and the power of truth. Police departments began implementing better body camera policies, more comprehensive K-9 training documentation, and improved community relations initiatives. Years later, when young officers were trained in K-9 procedures, they learned about the Duke case. They studied the incident from every angle: legal, procedural, ethical, and human. They learned about the importance of documentation, the dangers of assumptions, and the incredible power of an innocent observer speaking the truth. And they learned about a 3-year-old girl who, simply by being honest about what she'd seen, had changed the trajectory of justice. The legacy of that case lived on, not just in legal precedent or policy reform, but in the hearts and minds of countless officers who understood that their integrity, their commitment to truth, and their partnership with their K-9 units were sacred trusts that deserved to be protected and honored. Officer and Duke had been vindicated, but more importantly, they had reminded everyone that truth, spoken clearly and without agenda, was ultimately more powerful than any narrative, any media campaign, or any carefully constructed argument. In the end, the voice of innocence, whether it came from a police officer or a 3-year-old child, would prevail. The end.